honestly, if you take something away and you're not going to bring it back, you can frame that message in a way that says, we've removed this. We've already decided we're not going to bring it back because of X, Y, and Z. Thank you for the feedback. But just so you know, we want to be upfront and just give that to your support team as well, or whoever's answering tickets. And that actually helps in my experience. People trust you more if you don't give them a load of bull about, yeah, we're considering it and this sort of thing. So we pull out those kind of answers too.
This week's episode is brought to you by Reforge. No, just kidding. We don't do ads on this podcast, but I did think it was important to call out a couple of great features that are coming from Reforge in this week. And they're both AI-focused features. A real problem that many people have is an inability to get great real-time feedback on what you're working on. And today, the Reforge Chrome extension and browser extension launched on Product Hunt. The extension provides strategic, expert-based feedback right where you're working. So check out reforge.com/extension to try it now for free. What's really cool about this extension is that it helps you take everything in the Reforge library, everything we've ever put together from experts, and use it to create expert feedback on the actual docs and projects and things that you're actively working on. I think it's really great. You should check it out. I've been using it. You should use it too. Welcome back for this week's episode of Unsolicited Feedback. I'm your host, Fareed Mosavat. This week on the podcast, we are joined by Kurt Schrader. Kurt is the CEO and founder of Shortcut, a project management tool built specifically for startups. We kick off this week's episode and our riff section on some controversy around a new app release from Sonos. Both Kurt and I have been decade-plus long users of Sonos, so we share our personal reflections on this new update, but also talk about a lot of the controversy and concerns that many of their power user base had around this new app update. It's not just that they launched a new redesign and it had some problems and some features missing, but really that these features that were missing were particularly problematic for their power users. So we talk a little bit about how people can avoid this power user trap, how maybe some of the normal ways that product leaders and product managers evaluate feature usage and adoption by looking in the aggregate across all their user base may create blind spots for how they think about large changes like redesigns. We talk about how to avoid these power user traps. We talk about how you might be able to identify where these types of problems may exist for you if you're building big changes. And we talk a little bit about strategies for deprecating features, especially when power users are the ones using those features that you're ready to deprecate. Last, we spend a little bit of time talking about a strategy called pre-mortems, a way to evaluate what things might change, how to identify unknowns, and how to do some of your mitigations before you hit the fire of a new launch and lots of people have feedback. We'll get right into it with our discussion on Sonos. Kurt Schrader, welcome to Unsolicited Feedback. It's exciting to have you here. It sounds like you listen to the show sometimes, which is very exciting. And we were chatting beforehand, and I think you wanted to bring up the topic of the latest Sonos release, which seems to be generating a lot of negative buzz around the world of Sonos users. I don't know. Why don't you set the stage? What happened? What are we doing? Why are people upset about it?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I've been a Sonos user for 10 or so years. Fareed, I think you told me you've been 20 years, right, with Sonos? So
yeah. We got our first Sonos as a wedding present. I will age myself here, but we have been married for almost 18 years now. So it is almost 18 years old Sonos system in our house because a friend of mine had one. And I was like, this is the coolest thing ever. And just to be clear, 18 years ago is before the iOS App Store. So the Sonos I had didn't even have an app. It had a separate device called the Sonos controller that weighed 6 or 7 times as much as an iPhone, had a little click wheel. It looked like an iPod with a screen and allowed you to control your music from this device that had its own dedicated charger that sat in your room. It was like a very cool visual device that you could pass around the house and share and change music, add to the queue, etc. And so that was my first experience with it. And I remember looking at it and being like, I think this is going to be on my phone eventually, which is exactly what happened.
Just like everything, right? No, that's interesting. I've never seen one of those in person. So they're probably worth a bunch of money now, right? Or something like that.
I have no idea where mine is, which is actually disappointing. It would be a very cool, like, tech museum kind of item.
Just put it in the background there. Yeah, but I think Sonos did the thing that we've talked about, which is take the app and rewrite the whole thing. Let's rewrite the whole thing. And what could possibly go wrong when you do a full rewrite? And on one level, I've used the Sonos app for a long time. So it was bad. Like, it was not great. And they seemed to be stuck a little bit in a corner. But the thing that came out had a lot of problems and a lot of missing features. And you mentioned the other day too, who actually uses this app? Is it only power users? And those are people you're really going to irritate when you roll this out with the power user features missing, right? One of the things was you can't set alarms, you can't turn off alarms. And people who had alarms set, they just kept going. There was no way to turn them off, which is seems like a miss. Yeah. I didn't know a lot of people use Sonos for alarms. Sound like you guys do, but I
if people want to dig into this, I think there are a couple articles on The Verge that talk through and show some Reddit threads on the types of features and things that people are frustrated by. Which, number one, the people who are on the Sonos Reddit thread are 100% your most power users, right? Like, they're deeply involved in the community. They talk about it all the time, et cetera. Yeah. So alarms was like one of these sort of interesting, odd features that they decided not to implement. And they got a ton of complaints about it. So yeah, I have 2 kids. They each have a Sonos in their room for music because it seemed like the simplest way to give them something to be able to control their own music from their own phones and listen to stuff. And the beauty of this is we live in the modern age. They aren't allowed to have their phones in their room at night. So they can't use their phones as alarms. Makes a lot of sense. They're teenagers. You put a phone in their room, they'll never sleep. So we use their Sonoses for alarms. And it's a simple thing. It plays the music. They get to choose what music they want to listen to, or if they want the bong chime. My daughter actually has 6 alarms in a row set up because it's like the early alarm, the next alarm, I snooze the first alarm, wake me up. It's very college student style, even though she's in high school. And the new app doesn't allow you to control these alarms very well. And apparently they actually took it completely out because you could do some things and not others. And it turns out people with kids, this is a relatively common use case that people are now really upset is missing from the thing. And so I started thinking through, like, how does this happen? Because I think there's like a bigger product lesson here. And I suspect what happened is some product manager looked at the data when they were trying to figure out what should and shouldn't be in the V1 release of the new app and said, alarms are only used by some small percentage of users. And thus we can release this app. Hey, the desktop app can still do alarms. We can release this app and it can be missing alarms. It seems like a reasonable way of looking at the world, right? What percentage of users use a feature as you prioritize? And it turned out the small number of people using it turned out to be really loud, and it was really important to them as a core feature of the product. And I find that really interesting because a lot of the things we have from the outside that tell us how important is this can actually lead you pretty astray in terms of figuring out what is and isn't important. And so it made me wonder, how might you better prioritize or understand features for a large redesign if percentage adoption is a poor proxy, basically?
Yeah, I think you can visualize it in your head from a product manager perspective, right? There's just a stack of stuff. And when we get to a certain line, that's what we're going to ship with, right? And the things that fell beneath it, alarms, streaming locally seems to be a big one that not a lot of people probably use, but the people who do use it really want to stream locally, right? Their system is broken currently. And and I think you're exactly right, where 1%, 0.5% of people probably use all those things. But when they break, those are the people who are out there as your biggest fans. And it's hard to see that, right? They probably tested this with a lot of people who didn't use any of this stuff as well, right? There's an interesting bit of overlap there. I'm surprised they didn't do more of a staged rollout, right? Like, why wouldn't you roll out to 1%, 3%, 10%, and then at 10% go, oops, like, we're getting a lot of this. Like, maybe we should pause and spend another couple of weeks on this. It was such a big bang, and it didn't seem like it needed to be, right? And people were excited about this, but I don't think anyone was clamoring for the new app and like putting their foot down. I don't know what the precipitating event after it that forced their hand on this was.
So that's a great question. Like, why do a redesign? I think is actually a question that a lot of companies face. A lot of people imagine, at least in my experience, they imagine a big redesign is to drive metrics in the product. Let's improve usage, let's improve engagement, let's improve adoption of certain types of features. But I find that fundamentally, this tends to not be the case. In general, a redesign is at best the same. It's really like technical debt. I think redesigns are really like re-architectures, and product managers need to think of them like re-architectures as they think about how to stage these. And the goal is, hey, we can't add new stuff to the product very easily because the design system doesn't support it. Or it's starting to look really dated. It's not really hurting our metrics or our usage because people are used to it, but it's really hard to look good or modern vis-a-vis our competitors because of our design. So we need to do a refresh. Or there's a major rebrand or some other types of stuff. Kurt, I'm sure you can get into that because I know you've done a rebrand or at least one. And there's some major changes you need to make. And what ends up happening is it's really about you, the company, not about your customers, right? A redesign. You're actually trying to help them accept it in most cases. Look at how basic changes to Gmail drive people completely bananas, right? Because you move the cheese, like everything new is hard. And so I suspect they probably had some like foundational things, new products coming out or other things that made it very difficult for them to continue to innovate on the current stack and wanted to get to the new stack as soon as possible to accelerate internal development. But as a result, made some pretty big missteps in terms of what isn't there for their existing users, some of which were hard to justify, I think. For instance, local music is a key differentiator for a very small percentage of Sonos users. Most people are just streaming.
Yeah.
But for the people that care, they really care. So I'm trying to think through a framework to help people figure out, as you think about a big redesign or a big re-architecture, how do you think about what to sunset and what to stage a rollout on and what to make sure to include in V1 that's not just based on how many people use it, which I think is a really poor proxy.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I think it applies broadly to all your product management stuff. We're working through the question right now of, hey, we've got this product we built, a shortcut has a huge surface area. Is there anything we can take away? And if you look at anything, right, every single thing is used by some subset of people. So whenever you make a change, I think, and you make a good point a few minutes ago, you change anything in Gmail, everybody freaks out, right? If you change anything for whatever reason, sometimes we redesign part of our app. It was the oldest part, the most used part. We needed to rebuild it to make it a lot faster recently. But there's a few things, small things that aren't there. And immediately the tickets start coming in. Hey, I use this every day to do X. And you're like, one, I never thought of that. Two, here's a button to get you back to the old one for now until we figure out how to handle this. But whatever you take away, if you have a giant user base, and I'm sure Sonos has to have, I don't know, at least hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of customers, right? Like,
I would assume so.
There's no zeros in there. Coming up with a good heuristic for how to remove things or even just delay things seems pretty difficult. Maybe you go, what do the power users use most? Because I think a normal user is just going to go, I don't know, whatever. I'm going to go use AirPlay with my Sonos anyway, right? We talked about this. I AirPlay most of the time. I don't even know if my wife has the Sonos app installed, right? She probably just uses AirPlay for everything these days. So those people don't care at all.
I think that's actually a pretty good piece of advice there, which is, can you identify a power user generally for your product and ask the question, what does their adoption of features look like, right? So for the top 10% of users of the app, not Sonos generally, in this case, I would make sure to do because of what you were talking about, which is that you can use Sonos without the app, right? For a lot of different things. Of those top 10%, what are they using? And I suspect if you looked at that, you would see things like local music control and local music libraries are like way over indexed in that population. Maybe alarms would pop out. Maybe some of the complaints are about really funny stuff. I want to know when I have uncompressed audio playing. I think things like that, you can get it. Like those are gripes, but they're not regressions, right? They're just like small UI things. EQ usage. There's a lot of these things that these folks on Reddit are complaining about that I suspect are actually relatively high adoption for that small subset of really power users. So that might be one way of looking at this.
An interesting slice in there too, which is the people who want to know about uncompressed audio or Apple Music high quality. I don't think shows up right now. At least it didn't for me, and I couldn't tell, is it broken? Is it not there? And then I went, I don't really care. I'm still listening to music. I'll deal with this later. I think you can push that aside, but things, like the alarms and other things, seems like they would pop out with what you're thinking about.
Yeah. I think another way to look at it is try to answer the question, are there power users of this feature? Are there people with lots of alarms? Are there people with large music libraries? And then ask why. We had a good example of this at Slack. I didn't work on this directly, but there was a point in time when Slack, for a bunch of architectural reasons and like scalability reasons and other reasons, again, that are important to the company, but also for some like product reasons, it became harder and harder to support, wanted to deprecate the IRC gateway feature, which allowed you to like stream Slack messages into an IRC server. And it's a weird edge case. Most people don't even know it exists. Most people don't use it. It does lose a lot of fidelity, right? Like it's a bare subset of Slack stuff that you can do with the IRC gateway. It basically just streams messages. Threads were complicated. Emoji reactions were complicated. There's a whole bunch of stuff that made it hard, and it was like hard to maintain. It wasn't a big part of the strategy. It wasn't important to us. But what we learned, what the team learned, sorry, it wasn't we because I didn't work on it directly, was they dug into who's using the IRC gateway. And it turned out it was really important for, I think, things like screen readers and accessibility. That there was the subset of people using it actually had a very valid and deeply important to them use case for why this feature was important. And that means that you couldn't just deprecate it, right? Which, again, if you just look at the data, you're like, oh, it's X very tiny % of our users who use this. It's in deep in the settings. Let's just announce that we're cutting it and cut it. It was actually a much more complicated process. It was, how long are we going to give people before? Like, they effectively surprise deprecated a ton of features to users with no communication, which I think is another piece of the puzzle. So what did we do in that case? The team announced that it was happening. They explained that they understood what needed to be done to make parity, right? So it was like, how do we make screen readers work? We have to do a bunch of accessibility work. We're going to give you a ton of time to like transition. We're going to work closely with those customers to make sure the transition is actually positive. And maybe we'll turn off new connections first before we turn off legacy connections that are already there. And I don't remember the exact sequencing, but this kind of thing, deprecating a feature is a big decision. People say stuff willy-nilly, cut anything people aren't using, have focus, but it's actually way harder than it looks. It's almost as much as regular go-to-market to un-go-to-market with a feature. And so I think that's a big part of Sonos' mistake here.
Yeah, I think there's lots of threads in there too, right? If they could done like a pre-mortem and said, hey, what could go wrong when we do this? I think you could say, okay, for local music streaming, we're going to piss people off, but it's not going to be done in time and it's fine. And there's a workaround on the web, that sort of thing. People will figure it out. The people who probably stream locally can probably use the web app to do this. If somebody had said, hey, alarms, if we take away alarms, people's alarms are going to go off and they're not going to be able to turn them off. Someone would have probably gone, oh shit, I guess we should probably fix that. And we've done some of this stuff at Shortcut. We had a big foundational feature projects that we took away, and it's turned off for new users. It still exists for some legacy plans because they need it. And we recently had a thing where we set up an AI help bot, and it found the old instructions for it and was telling people how to turn it on. So that was fun. But, we knew how people were using it. And now that subset of users is getting smaller and smaller. And here's how you transition off. And we help people transition off. At some point, we'll rip the Band-Aid off. But it was a long process because it was a fundamental piece. And we knew we would have lost a bunch of customers if we just said, turn it off, use the new thing. This is how you do it. We thought through all those eventualities beforehand before we rolled it out.
Yeah, I think this is the important bit here is it's a forced migration. There's a lot of regret. There's basically deprecations of features, some of which they say are coming back, but I suspect a bunch are not. And it has unclear upside. Like there's nothing in return, as far as I can tell, using the Sonos app. It's prettier, sorta. It's everything's in a different place. Fine. It has a little bit better customization. But I think like the thing that I struggled with as I read the press releases and stuff for this is there was nothing that they were hanging their hat on, so to speak, as, hey, I know we took some stuff away from you, but this is way better. And here's why. Here's the win you got from it. And no one cares about your design system, your inability to ship new products, your communication protocols that need to get upgraded, et cetera. They just want their stuff to work.
Yeah, no, there's nothing. They're shipping headphones, but as far as I can tell, that doesn't even use the app and it shouldn't need to. Yeah, so where do we go with this? It doesn't feel like there's any upside at the end of the day on what they put out there.
So interestingly enough, they did do this once before. There was the S1 app. This was a while ago, and they upgraded to the S2 app. And the S1 app actually still exists in the App Store. By the way, you can go get Sonos S1 controller. And the reason it exists, and I knew this, is because the new app did not support the first generation of devices, of which I actually had a couple. Because again, these things last forever. This is, by the way, one of the like really awesome qualities of Sonos. It is the only software-driven, modern consumer electronic device that works like you expected a consumer electronic device to work 30 years ago, which is you plug it in and it works forever. Like most of this stuff is so ephemeral, but their stuff does last a very long time. And what they did was you would download the S2 controller, it would upgrade your systems, and then you couldn't go back. So there was this whole, do I keep S1? Do I go to S2? Am I forced to use S1? Some of my stuff uses this one, some of it uses that one. And I think it took them a long time to transition. And I'm wondering whether that lesson has led them to be like, we cannot support two code bases for a decade. Like, we got to flip the switch and we got to rip the Band-Aid fast. But again, that's a like you problem, not a customer problem.
Yeah. I went through that too. I can't remember though. It seems, did we get something from S2, like maybe Atmos sound or something that couldn't be done in S1? It feels like probably, at least they were the promise of something. I can't remember what it was.
I think the S1 app was like jank too. Like it didn't work that great. It wasn't that awesome. And I do want to commend Sonos for that, though, that they understand that they are building devices that are meant to stay in your system and your home for a very long time. Right? I know people who spent tons of money on like home automation gear that's built into the walls of their house to do multi-room audio that like looks cool for 2 years and then it never updates. It doesn't know about streaming services. It's basically like bricked stuff that's inside your walls forever. And Sonos did split this difference really well. It's an updating system that also will just work. Like it will just sit there in your house and it will work and it will play Pandora or will play Spotify and you will be able to use it forever, no matter what. And I always thought that was pretty cool, that I couldn't believe this first device I had worked for over a decade. I only replaced it once, like a physical part went bad. And I was totally fine with replacing it after 12 years. And that's pretty impressive right now. Like my iPhone may not make it another 6 months here. And that's like $1,000. It's twice the price of a Sonos.
There's another possibility here, I think, which is looking at, they're going to ship some new headphones, but the headphones, you can't sync to the music from the app or anything like that. And they ship this app without a bunch of features. Like, part of me goes, maybe the leadership is just bad at product now. Like they turned over a lot of people there over the last few years. When you listen to their responses to things, they did the classic thing and said, this took courage to ship a new app, which is not a great look. Maybe their new CEO, newish CEO is just not a product guy. And it's just, hey, what do you mean it's not ready to go? Just push it out there. I need to go talk to some people about it. So I think that's a possibility as well. There might be some other pressure coming internally that we've all experienced at one time or another.
Yeah, it does take some amount of courage to release a brand new thing into the world, but it got panned when Apple said it, and Apple is Apple, and it is rightfully panned when like Sonos says it, because again, your customers don't care about a redesign. I think if there's any takeaway from this, more than any other thing, is except in the most extreme and awesome circumstances, your customers are going to hate a redesign. Guaranteed. Almost certainly, because you moved stuff that they got used to using. I'm having a really hard time thinking of very many examples. The new Slack is now, after 6 to 9 months, a better experience than the previous version. I guarantee you, if I flipped it back for you, you'd be like, yuck. This thing is not what I want. But when it comes out, everybody's upset. So even if you like execute well on it and don't deprecate any features, people hate them. So to say it takes courage is, okay, great internal message, but not the one to say to your customers. No one cares.
Yeah. I wonder how much productivity was wasted the day the new Slack came out, because all anybody did that day was complain about new Slack as it rolled out.
Yeah. And I think that's actually maybe a worthwhile takeaway here. Maybe they're wrong. Like maybe Sonos did build a good app with the right features removed that nobody actually cares about. A lot of this is just near-term noise.
Yeah.
What's the right time to deeply evaluate redesign feedback? Because it's definitely not day one. I'm curious, Kurt, maybe having gone through some of this, how you all thought about when to take feedback seriously and when not to.
Yeah, it's really interesting, right? Like I saw all this noise, and I think you did too, and whoa, turn off automatic app updates, right? What is this? Oh, it's going to be a disaster. And then a few weeks later, I just said, okay, I'll just try it now. I don't use these features that often. I'll upgrade and see what happened. And then I did, and it was fine, right? I think that's the best result that you can get from a redesign, right? Nobody, I don't think, very rare, maybe Mac OS to the first Mac OS X where it was like Candy Mac, right? That was pretty cool. But that was a one-time, and Steve Jobs has waved his magic wand back then, right? Like it's the only one I could think of where it was like, wow, this is really cool. It's a lot different. And I think in general, you're just looking for, is this going to let our team move faster so we can build things better for our customers? Does it support the vision of where we want to go with things? And then, are our customers, maybe some of them are irritated, some of them are upset, like anything. We changed the name of our company and people are still upset about it, right? Or they say, oh, you should change the name back. I'm like, I can't. It's a whole thing. But there was a lot of pushback. And every time we've done a redesign, every time I've done a redesign everywhere, you get people who are really loud who go, I like it the old way. Why did you do this? What's going on here? Why would you ever do this? And now I have to learn something new. And even if it's minimal, and you can go out there and say, look, everything's aligned better. This is going to be easier. It takes 3 left clicks and they don't care. Like it's just different. We're frustrated. And why do we do this? And I'm going to nitpick every single little thing. But I think you're right to your question, right? Like maybe 3-6 months, right? You got to see if you can fix the sharp edges, you can fix the paper cuts away. And by the end of that, most of this should have tailed out. And then you can start to build on top of this, I hope. Like my hope for the Sonos app is it's been rebuilt in a way where they can move faster because there was nothing there, right? Like the search was bad, everything was bad. And if this gives you resets the clock so you can move faster, then great. Let's see what happens. That ultimately outweighs things. And maybe they're just like, we knew this was going to happen. We're just going to get through it. And when we get out of the other side, people are going to be happy with the new stuff we're releasing. So that's what I'm waiting to see.
You mentioned something earlier about doing a pre-mortem on this. And I'm curious if you were going through a similar change, what is a pre-mortem? What are you trying to solve there? And how do you think about it?
Yeah, I think whenever you're rolling out a big change or even a medium-sized change, right? Who is this going to affect? How is it going to affect them? How could this go wrong? This is upside. You can always run a post-mortem and say, what went right, what went wrong? And when I do a pre-mortem, this is going to change it. We know who it's going to affect generally. What are the downsides? What's the feedback we're going to get? What are we going to see here? And some of it can be addressed quickly, right? It helps you prepare, in my experience, for we think we're going to get these 5 questions from people, or questions and complaints. And you can just be ready, right? If somebody emails you and said, hey, change this. I used to do it this way. I hate it the new way. Like, people feel very strongly about certain things. And if you have an answer, a response ready to go, like, part of, for me, what comes out of a pre-mortem is, here's the 10 things. Let's get our responses queued up. So when somebody comes in, you can respond to them in a minute. If you get back to them right away, like, they're usually like, okay, cool, thanks. If you wait 3 days and think about it and don't respond, then you get another
or say, we're considering this. Thanks for your feedback. It feels hollow. Yeah.
I'm going to pass this on to the product team. And then they're like, that sucked.
I know where that goes.
So, get ahead of as much of that as possible. And also, honestly, if you take something away and you're not going to bring it back, you can frame that message in a way that says, we've removed this. We've already decided we're not going to bring it back because of X, Y, and Z. Thank you for the feedback. But just so you know, we want to be upfront and just give that to your support team as well, or whoever's answering tickets. And that actually helps, in my experience. People trust you more if you don't give them a load of bull about, we're considering it and this sort of thing. So we pull out those kind of answers too and try to make sure we've covered our ground there. And then, is there a big problem that could resolve from this, right? If we go back to the alarms thing, that's a big problem if nobody can turn off their alarms. And if the workaround is, if you have a speaker with, hey, Sonos, you can say, hey, Sonos, turn it, right? Kind of a workaround. Are people going to figure that out in the moment? When you crash your car, what are all the people you have to call? Nobody ever knows this stuff because they don't run through like the checklist of things to do. And I think you want to run through that checklist beforehand to figure out all the problems and how you can mitigate them as much as possible.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of doing this kind of approach for big changes. I think, one, just knowing what your response is to customers for what I would call the known knowns. People are going to be upset about this, that you're not ready. And sometimes you are caught flat-footed around this. For instance, I suspect, let's just pretend we're in the room for a second. We know alarms aren't here, but maybe you already have a release date because you did this pre-mortem a month before the launch. You said alarms aren't going to make it, but we know it's going to be in V2 because we've spec'd it, we've designed it, we've scoped it, and we've put a team on it. And we know it's not going to make it, but we know it's going to be a big complaint, so it's ready to go. So that's one category. The other is, the stuff you talked about. How do you communicate this to customers? Another is, if this is a problem, then we'll do X. That's really hard to do when you're in chaos, right? This is probably a chaotic support moment. So the idea that your product team is going to effectively deliver on a fast follow they haven't spent any time thinking about is probably pretty hard. To use the Slack example of the last redesign, and this was well after I left. So again, just looking from the outside, they had a really big complaint about the workspace switcher, which is a really good example here because most Slack users, at least when I work there, have one workspace, the company they work at. But guess who has 10? All the power users. Yeah. Every power user of Slack has many Slacks. And so again, you have one of these only 2% of people, small number of percent, I don't know what the number is, percent of people have this problem. But for the people who have the problem, it's the biggest problem in the world for them. And so what did they do? A week later, there was the workspace switcher default change. They made it a setting. They did exactly the right thing to make it awesome for me and awesome for all the people with one. Sweet. They get the win out of that. And probably because someone anticipated that was going to happen and said, we're not going to be ready, but we're going to run pretty quickly at it. Let's see what the feedback is. Yeah. And then there's the other, which is the known unknowns, which is we have no idea how many support tickets we're going to get. We have no idea if adoption of this important feature is going to drop by 10%. But you can start to ask, what will I measure to make sure I have an answer to this question? This one's important around pricing type stuff. Because this might hurt our monetization, but I have no idea by how much. Let's make sure we're measuring that. Let's make sure we have it up front, these kinds of things. And I think this process of a pre-mortem basically means you're ready. Yeah, I love the way you describe it. I'm ready when we hit the scary moment. I'm not scrambling to solve stuff because I already have a plan.
Yeah. Yeah. And I wonder too, there's a piece of this as I think about it a little bit. I saw a fair amount online of this has pissed me off so much I'm going to leave Sonos. Right? And it's okay, but where are you going to go? There is they don't really have there's no alternative. And I think about that in the context of I have a Apple Watch. I'm assuming you have an Apple Watch or you've had one before. They'll do all sorts of weird stuff to watch OS time they release a new one. people get angry. You can't do this anymore. And the buttons have all changed. And then they go, but where are you going to go? Right? You're going to replace your Apple Watch with Garmin? That's going to be worse. Or what? Something, everything else doesn't work with iOS. So maybe there's a bit of that, right? I wonder how that plays into the calculus. Most of us don't really have that. If we screw something up bad, people are going to jump to another tool, right? And I wonder how much that is built into sort of their thinking on these things as well.
Yeah, I think it's a piece of the puzzle, but you have to be careful. You don't want to take it for granted. I'm sure we can all think of tools that lots of people use and everybody hates using that are common, and they are a long-term drag. I do think it does make you susceptible when alternatives do appear to switching. I don't know, like HR software or whatever, expense stuff. So you're like, I use this because I have to, because getting paid back is really important, but I hate it. And then something new and modern, Expensify finally shows up and you're like, we're done. We're moving over. Like, I want it immediately, that kind of thing. Or Brex or whatever it is. And so I do think you have to be careful as a product builder of the whole, like, it didn't affect retention, so it doesn't matter. I think that's true, and it should give you some space to make big changes, but you have to win back the trust. You lose something and you win it back by doing what your customers expect, the way you described. We made this redesign. There were some problems. We immediately communicated what we were going to do, and you win that trust back with your customers, and then they are back to where they started. I think you bring up an awesome point, right? Which is that Sonos has a pretty high lock-in. They have a lot of room, right, to mess around, try different things. I have 5 or 6 Sonos devices in my house. They're physical hardware. They're plugged into the wall. They're in my kids' rooms. They're in my living room. They're connected to other stereo systems. It's going nowhere. Honestly, the app could just, like, as long as it airplays, it's going to stick around for a while. Eventually, I might get frustrated, but there's zero chance I'm switching. So they have this lock-in. And this resembles a lot of business software things as well, right? There's a lot of lock-in when you use an HRIS, when you use a task management system, when you use collaboration. But there are these categories where there's like a lot of frustration with the product, but really hard for new entrants or new things to come out. And one that I am partial to, again, we'll go back to Slack, is I think there is a lot of noise about whether real-time chat-based communication is an effective way to do work. And that groundswell has grown substantively over time, I think. And Slack kind of hit around on Twitter and other places around it, but it's been like deeply resilient as a category, right? Like Teams aside, but like Teams and Slack are like really resilient. Outlook and G Suite are really resilient, regardless of how much people hate email. And I'm curious, like, how much you work in work collaboration and team management, that kind of thing. What are your views on this? What would need to be true for someone to actually emerge as a new version of this? And what would they need to do it when there's so much lock-in and like network effects around some of these products, like Slack and email and Outlook, et cetera?
I think part of it is very related to when we talked about redesigns earlier, right? It was like things are in a different place or something slightly different than what I'm used to. And I think a big part of this is, hey, I know how Slack works. I use it every day. I have 20 complaints about it maybe, and somebody doesn't like it. But when you bring in something totally new, and obviously near and dear to my heart, we are replacing a Jira instance or something like that. And anything that deviates from what someone's fixed long-term expectation is makes it hard for people to move. You get that complaint, right? If you're the champion, if you, Fareed, are like, hey, I'm bringing in a new tool, people have expectations about how it's going to work. And anything that's different, number one, they're going to complain about. Number two, they're probably going to complain to you. They're not going to go, hey, I'm going to go figure this out or go talk to support. They're going to go, hey, I'm going to go talk to Fareed or Kurt, the person who made me use this thing, right?
I think this is a really good point about the champion. I think especially in the way modern software, business software is adopted, which is generally a single person signing up for a service, maybe free, maybe not, maybe demo, maybe self-serve. We don't have to get into whether it's product-led growth or not, but generally a single person looking to improve, especially with productivity, just the general productivity of their local team. And that person takes on a ton of risk, like a ton of internal career risk, reputation risk, etc. And you're asking them a lot to be like, let's just think about something as simple as an analytics tool. I want to like do our instrumentation. Everybody else uses X, but we should use Y. And if you don't equip that person with a really great answer to why shouldn't we use Slack, Amplitude, Jira, whatever those things are, right? That are the default. It's like the joke, nobody gets fired for buying IBM. I don't think that's true anymore, but there are equivalent. Yeah, there are equivalent versions. Salesforce, HubSpot, right? These are all like the default in these particular categories. You need to be able to immediately show, not just, you need to equip that champion to prove to their teams that it's better. Yeah. And there has to be something there because you're asking that person to take that risk. I think that's such a good point. There are a lot of, for instance, let's just use this again, the Slack example, internal team communication things that are good. They are different. They do solve some of the problems that a tool like Slack has, or Workspace or Teams or whatever they are. But it's really hard to get at why is it better? It's just, oh, it has these threads instead of this thing, and I can archive a conversation. That's not good enough. The problem it solves, which is noise and confusion, is like a first world later problem, not an immediate when I'm making the decision to try something problem. And so it's this disconnect. And I haven't seen anybody effectively solve that yet in the workspace communication realm. Yeah. And I think the only other option you have is find a group of people who don't use the incumbent thing yet. And a lot of companies are chasing startups, which is good in some respects because you're like, oh, they're a new company. They don't have an analytics tool yet. So it's pretty easy to be like, put my JavaScript snippet in your website instead of somebody else's. Yeah. Or whatever it is. But the downside of that is, even though the company doesn't have a default, the customer category does. Yeah. And so what's been interesting to me is seeing HubSpot for X, where X is like some subset of the world where nobody even uses a CRM, or communication tools for, I'm just going to invent stuff. Let's say like outdoor dining restaurants. I'm just making something up where you're like, oh, okay, let's do a Slack for that, for fast casual restaurants or something like that. You're like, oh, I can see how that might get adopted because like Slack and Teams aren't the default, right? That kind of thing. It has its own challenges, but I think that's the only other way, and being opinionated or specific to that. But then, of course, you're not a horizontal tool that anyone else in the world can use, like Microsoft Teams or Slack or Workday or whatever.
Yeah. And I think you see some of those sort of, take Notion as an example, right? Like Notion's, to me, natural competitor are Google Docs, Word, that's true. And now they've added sort of spreadsheets. There's a lot you can do in Notion. But I think someone told me once, like a whole bunch of Notion users come from TikTok, right? There's people out there like, hey, I've got these Notion templates, I can build things, and they make their TikToks, and then people come over and those are like 2 or 3 person plans. And I would never, imagine, I would assume at the beginning, they didn't think we're going to get a bunch of users from TikTok, right? No. Probably still are like, what's going on here? I would be. Like, they've gone into these like smaller holes because at a certain point, if I've got 1,000 people on Notion, I don't know how much that costs, but it's got to be pretty expensive. And we already have Gmail and G Suite, so maybe I'll just go use that instead. Everybody moving over here to this thing. And I don't know. Yeah, there's a lot of tension there on that front.
But I feel like Notion did have a good answer to that question, which is like, why is this better than Google Docs? Or probably alternatively, why is this better than Wiki tools, right? And it's depending on which side you were coming from, it had a good answer. Notion is as easy to edit as a Google Doc, but has great organization. We can argue about whether that's true or not. But if you were a champion, what you would do, and you probably started by doing it for yourself, and you're like, we have to use this at work because, oh my God, I can't find a Google Doc for the life of me. Like they are write only, they disappear into the ether. Notion allows me to like structure and document things a lot better. Okay, that's a good answer. From the wiki side, it's organized like a wiki, but I have a good editor, right? And that's like a pretty good value prop. And all of a sudden, if you're a champion, you can sell that, right? You can sell it very simply by sharing a doc. Just being like, look how easy it is to get to all of my thoughts on this thing in an organized way. And so I think it nails that test. And then it's okay to be horizontal. But if you're building a Notion competitor, the amount of minimum market requirements you'd have to build to compete is just incredibly high, right?
Yeah, now that it's sunk in, it reminds me when I lived in San Francisco, I had a conversation with someone once who was starting a video hosting company. This was 15 years ago. I said, "Oh, what's the difference between your company and YouTube?" And he told me, "Oh, it can do high definition video." And I was like, "Yeah, but aren't they just going to do that?" And he was like, "I don't think so." And I just walked away from that conversation like, that's not actually a thing. So yeah, I don't know what the wedge is to move beyond that.
Yeah. Whereas I will just be clear. For instance, I'm friends with we had the CEO of Wistia on the pod a long time ago. It's like, whoa, video is the future, but companies don't want to put their video on YouTube where they don't control the distribution. They want to be able to self-host, self-manage, and maybe publish to YouTube, but they don't want it hosted there. They want to own their own thing. That's a good sell because it's like YouTube, but you own it. If you're looking at a market, it's what's the twist that actually resonates and actually matters is probably a good approach to come up with new startup ideas.
Totally. I think the Loom team did a really good job of that too. That's just video, but it was very focused how it was going to be distributed, how they worked with it. It's more internally focused, and they nailed that one.
Yep. We have a great episode on Loom's growth loop for anyone who's listening who wants to check it out. It's last season, but we do a pretty good breakdown around their acquisition timeframe. And that's a wrap on part 1 of our episode with Kurt Schrader, the CEO of Shortcut. Coming up in part 2, we're going to talk about Microsoft's latest Windows and AI recall announcements. It's a super interesting discussion, and we dive into a little bit of compare and contrast with Microsoft and Apple strategies.